London, November 1851. The rain fell in cold, relentless sheets against the soaring Gothic windows of St. Paul's Cathedral, each droplet trailing down the ancient glass like tears the living were too proper to shed. Inside the vast sanctuary, hundreds of mourners filled the pews, their black attire creating a sea of somber fabric that stretched beneath the magnificent dome, while the scent of funeral lilies hung thick in the air, cloying and sweet, a fragrance that would forever after make Catherine Ashworth's stomach turn. She stood in the front pew, perfectly still in her widow's weeds, the heavy black bombazine gown restrictive around her ribs, the thick veil obscuring her face like a shroud for the living. At 28 years of age, Catherine presented the very picture of grieving propriety. Her gloved hands clasped around a black-bound prayer book, her posture impeccable despite the weight of the elaborate mourning costume that seemed designed to punish the wearer as much as honor the dead. The bishop's voice echoed through the cavernous space, speaking of Lord Edmund Ashworth's virtue, his service to the crown, his distinguished lineage, each word landing on Catherine's shoulders like another stone in an already unbearable burden. She had stood thus for over an hour, listening to lies elevated to eulogy, watching as London's elite paid their respects to a man they privately knew to be a scoundrel, all while maintaining the elaborate fiction that society demanded. The grey November light filtered through the stained glass windows, casting muted colours across the cold marble floor. Blues and reds and golds that seemed drained of all vibrancy, as lifeless as the man in the ornate casket before the altar. Catherine's eyes remained fixed on that casket, constructed of the finest mahogany with silver handles, a monument to wealth and status that Edmund had never truly possessed, having gambled away most of his inheritance before their marriage. 5 years, she thought, the words repeating in her mind like a bitter litany. 5 years of waiting for affection that would never come. 5 years of separate bedrooms and cold formality, of hoping that perhaps today he might look at her with something other than vague irritation or complete indifference. 5 years of convincing herself that duty and respectability were sufficient foundations for a marriage, that love was a frivolous notion better suited to novels than to real life among the aristocracy. As the service drew to its conclusion, the mourners rose as one, the rustle of fabric and shuffle of feet creating a sound like wind through dead leaves. Catherine remained standing, her hands trembling slightly against the prayer book, the only outward sign of the turmoil within. It was then, in that moment of transition between ceremony and departure, that she heard the whisper that would shatter what remained of her carefully maintained composure. Lady Pemberton, standing just behind and to the left, leaned toward her companion, her voice low, but not quite low enough. "Poor Mrs. Ashworth," the woman said, her tone dripping with false sympathy. Wearing black for a man who kept a mistress in Chelsea the entire 5 years of their marriage there. At least she's finally free of the humiliation. The words struck Catherine like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. She stood frozen, her fingers tightening convulsively around the prayer book until the leather binding creaked in protest. The mistress in Chelsea. 5 years, the entire duration of their marriage. Somewhere in the rational part of her mind, Catherine understood that she had known, or at least suspected, that Edmund's frequent absences and complete disinterest in her company meant he was finding companionship elsewhere. But to hear it stated so baldly, to realize that all of London society knew, that they had known all along and pitied her, or worse, laughed at her behind their fans and over their tea, that knowledge crashed over her like a wave of ice water. Lady Pemberton and her companion moved away, continuing their progress down the aisle, leaving Catherine standing alone in her pew, surrounded by hundreds of people yet more isolated than she had ever been. The cathedral seemed to press in around her, the magnificent architecture suddenly oppressive, the soaring dome and ornate decorations a cage dressed in beauty. She forced herself to breathe, to maintain the composure that had been drilled into her since childhood, the unwavering dignity expected of a woman of her station. Her father-in-law, Lord Thomas Ashworth, appeared at her elbow, his weathered face composed in what might have been mistaken for grief by those who did not know him. He took her arm with practiced gentleness, the gesture one of support, but also of possession, a reminder that even in widowhood she remained bound to the Ashworth name. And "You performed your duty admirably, Catherine," he said, his voice pitched low for her ears alone. "The Ashworth name remains untarnished thanks to your discretion." She looked up at him, seeing in his pale blue eyes the same calculation that had characterized his son, the same ability to view people as assets or liabilities rather than human beings deserving of consideration. He knew, she realized with another jolt of understanding. He had always known about the mistress, about Edmund's neglect, about the hollow mockery of their marriage. And he approved, as long as she had maintained appearances, as long as she had played her assigned role without complaint or scandal. "Catherine," he said again, his grip on her arm tightening slightly. "The carriage is waiting. We must lead the procession to the cemetery." She nodded mutely, allowing herself to be guided down the aisle, past the rows of mourners who watched with expressions ranging from genuine sympathy to avid curiosity to barely concealed satisfaction at witnessing her humiliation. As they emerged into the cold November rain, Catherine lifted her face slightly, letting the icy drops strike her veil, wanting to feel something other than the numbness that had settled over her like a second shroud. The carriage that would carry her to the cemetery loomed before her, black and imposing, drawn by horses with black plumes nodding from their heads. She was handed inside by footmen whose faces she could not see through her veil, settling onto the black velvet cushions in the dim interior that smelled of expensive leather and decay. As the carriage lurched into motion, Catherine finally allowed her rigid posture to collapse, her shoulders curving forward as if under an unbearable weight. Through the rain-streaked window, she watched the grey streets of London pass by, the respectable townhouses and fashionable squares where she had lived her entire life, suddenly foreign and hostile. She had been raised to be the perfect gentleman's wife, educated in music and watercolours and French, trained in household management and the subtle arts of social navigation. She had entered her marriage with Edmund Ashworth, believing that affection might grow between them, that respect and companionship would develop over time. Instead, she had spent 5 years as little more than an ornament, displayed when necessary to maintain appearances, otherwise ignored and forgotten. "You were merely an ornament to preserve reputation," she thought, finally allowing herself to acknowledge the truth she had been avoiding. A convenient fiction to maintain the illusion of respectability, while Edmund pursued his own pleasures elsewhere. The rain continued to fall as the funeral procession wound through London toward the cemetery, and Catherine sat alone in the darkness of the carriage, wearing black for a husband who had never loved her, grieving not for the man she had lost, but for the 5 years of her life she would never recover, for the girl she had been who believed duty and propriety would somehow be enough. 3 months had passed since Edmund's funeral, and Catherine Ashworth found herself imprisoned in a tomb of her own making, or rather, one that society and the Ashworth family had constructed around her with ruthless efficiency. February 1852 brought bitter cold to London, frost etching delicate patterns on the windows of Ashworth House, the modest townhouse in Bloomsbury that had been part of her marriage settlement and now served as her cage. Her private sitting room had been transformed into a shrine to grief she did not feel, every surface draped in black crepe that absorbed what little winter light managed to penetrate the heavy curtains. The mirrors had been covered according to custom, reflecting nothing, as if even her own image was too vivid for the performance of mourning. Black fabric shrouded the furniture, black ribbons adorned the picture frames, and even the clock on the mantelpiece had been stopped at the hour of Edmund's death. Freezing time in that moment, as if she too had ceased to exist as anything other than a monument to loss. The house itself seemed to hold its breath, sounds muted and distant, footsteps on the stairs dulled by black runners, voices in the hallway reduced to whispers. Catherine sat in a high-backed chair near the inadequate fire, for even the flames seemed diminished in this atmosphere of enforced gloom, her black bombazine gown rustling stiffly as she shifted position. The mourning costume was no less restrictive than the one she had worn at the funeral, the corset laced tight beneath layers of black silk and wool, the high collar seeming to choke her, the heavy skirts weighing her down as if grief itself had physical mass. She was permitted no relief from this uniform of widowhood, no touch of white at the collar or cuffs, no jewelry save her wedding ring and a mourning brooch containing a lock of Edmund's hair that she wore only when expecting visitors from the Ashworth family. Those visits came with depressing regularity, Lord Thomas and his sister appearing weekly to ensure Catherine was maintaining proper standards of grief, speaking in hushed tones about duty and family honour, reminding her that a full year of deep mourning was expected before she could even consider half-mournings, greys and lavenders. The topic of her future was never directly addressed, but she understood the unspoken expectation that she would remain forever attached to the Ashworth name, a perpetual widow whose only purpose was to reflect well upon her late husband's memory. This particular afternoon, Catherine had finally summoned the courage to sort through Edmund's personal effects, a task she had been putting off since his death. His solicitor had delivered several boxes of papers and belongings, assuring her that anything of real value had already been catalogued for the estate. These were merely personal items of no monetary significance. She had asked her maid Mary to bring the boxes to her sitting room, needing privacy for what felt like a final reckoning with the man she had married. Mary, who had been with Catherine since before her marriage, had given her a long, knowing look before withdrawing, understanding as she always did what Catherine could not speak aloud. Now Catherine sat before 3 wooden boxes, her hands trembling slightly as she lifted the lid of the first. Inside lay the detritus of Edmund's life. Calling cards and invitations, racing forms and gambling chits, a silver flask engraved with his initials, a collection of cheap novels of the sensational variety. Nothing of substance, nothing that spoke to who he had been beyond the superficial. The second box contained more of the same, along with a miniature portrait of a woman Catherine did not recognize, beautiful and dark-haired, her expression knowing in a way that made Catherine's stomach tighten. She set the miniature aside and reached for the third box, smaller than the others, containing what appeared to be correspondence. The letters were tied with a faded blue ribbon, incongruous against all the black surrounding her, and as Catherine untied the bundle with fingers gone numb from more than just the cold, she recognized Edmund's handwriting on the envelopes. They were addressed to a Mrs. Arabella Norton at a residence in Chelsea, and even before Catherine opened the first letter, she knew with terrible certainty what she would find. The letters spanned the entire 5 years of their marriage, beginning just weeks after their wedding and continuing almost until Edmund's death. Catherine read them in chronological order, her expression frozen, her body very still, as Edmund's voice spoke to her from beyond the grave with more honesty than he had ever shown her in life. To his mistress, he was witty and passionate, writing of his devotion and desire, of the tedium of his obligations and his longing to be free of them. In one letter dated shortly after their marriage, he wrote with casual cruelty, "The Ashworth girl has a comfortable portion and asks no questions. She'll serve the purpose well enough. Her £10,000 will settle the worst of my debts and keep my father from disinheriting me entirely. As for affection, well, that's what I have you for, my darling Bella." Catherine read the words 3 times, needing to be certain she had not misunderstood, though their meaning was brutally clear. £10,000. That was what she had been worth to Edmund, the inheritance from her mother that had passed to her husband upon their marriage. She had known the money was part of the arrangement, of course. Marriage among their class was always partly financial, but she had believed there was at least some regard, some foundation beyond mere transaction. Now she understood that even that small dignity had been a delusion. She had been purchased to pay gambling debts, selected not for any quality of character or person, but simply because her portion was sufficient and her nature compliant. The subsequent letters painted an even bleaker picture, Edmund writing to his mistress about the boring necessity of occasionally dining with his wife, of keeping up appearances for society and his father, of his relief that Catherine never demanded anything of him beyond basic courtesy. He joked about her earnest attempts to please him in the early months of their marriage, her careful management of his household, her quiet presence at social functions. To Arabella Norton, Edmund presented Catherine as a convenient fiction, a role being played, not a real woman with thoughts and feelings and hopes that he was systematically destroying through his indifference. When Catherine finally set down the last letter, the winter afternoon had faded into evening, the fire had burned low, and her hands were shaking so badly that the papers rustled like autumn leaves. She sat in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the suffocating black crepe and the evidence of her husband's betrayal, feeling something shift inside her chest. It was not the sharp pain of fresh heartbreak, for she realized she had not loved Edmund enough for his faithlessness to truly wound her heart. Instead, it was a slower, colder understanding, a recognition that she had spent 5 years of her life playing a part in someone else's fiction, that she had subordinated her own desires and dreams to a marriage that had been nothing but a financial transaction dressed in the trappings of respectability. Catherine stood abruptly, moving to the window and pulling back the heavy curtain to look out at the street below. Gaslight flickered in the February dusk, illuminating the respectable facades of neighboring houses, behind whose windows other lives were being lived, other dramas playing out. She lifted her left hand, looking at the gold wedding band that had encircled her finger for 5 years, leaving a pale stripe on her skin where the metal had blocked the sun. For a long moment she simply stared at it, this symbol of a bond that had never truly existed. Then, with a decisive motion, she twisted it off her finger for the first time since Edmund had placed it there. The ring came away easily, as if it too recognized it no longer belonged, and Catherine held it in her palm, feeling its weight, so light for something that had been such a burden as the mark it left on her finger was stark, a band of pale skin that would fade in time, but for now stood as evidence of what she had endured. She heard a soft knock at the door, and Mary entered with a tea tray, her practical face showing concern as she took in the scattered letters and Catherine's rigid posture by the window. The maid set down the tray and came to stand beside her mistress, not speaking, simply offering silent companionship. "You've served your time, ma'am," Mary said finally, her voice gentle but firm. Any more mourning would be for a ghost that never existed. Catherine turned to look at her maid, this woman who had witnessed her marriage from its hopeful beginning to its hollow end, and felt tears prick her eyes for the first time since the funeral. What does a woman do, Mary, when she discovers she's grieving a fiction? The question hung in the air between them, unanswerable and terrible. Mary reached out and squeezed Catherine's hand, a breach of propriety that spoke to the affection between them. "You stop grieving the fiction, ma'am, and start living the truth, whatever that might be." That evening, after Mary had withdrawn and Catherine was alone again in her black-draped prison, she did something she had not permitted herself in the 3 months since Edmund's death. She went to the bookshelf hidden behind a panel in the wall, a small collection of novels that she had accumulated over the years, stories that were considered too passionate, too unconventional for proper young ladies. Edmund had never known about this collection, had never cared enough about her private hours to inquire how she spent them. Now Catherine selected a worn copy of Jane Eyre, a story of a woman who refused to accept the limitations placed upon her, who demanded to be seen and valued for who she truly was. She settled into her chair, pulled a shawl around her shoulders against the cold that seemed to emanate from the very walls, and began to read by the light of a single candle. Outside, winter rain began to fall, tapping against the windows like fingers seeking entrance, and somewhere in the distance a clock chimed the hour. But in her chair, surrounded by the trappings of false grief, Catherine felt the first stirrings of something she had not experienced in 5 years, perhaps longer. It was not happiness, not yet, but it was awareness, a recognition that the prison in which she sat had no real bars. That the mourning she performed was for a marriage that had never deserved her loyalty, that somewhere beyond these black-draped walls was a life she had not yet imagined, waiting for a woman brave enough to claim it. Late March brought the first tentative signs of spring to London, though winter seemed reluctant to relinquish its hold entirely, and on this particular afternoon Catherine found herself walking through Hyde Park in defiance of every expectation placed upon her. The expedition had not been planned, rather it had been born of desperation after yet the stifling visit from Lord Thomas Ashworth, who had spent an hour lecturing her on the impropriety of being seen in public during deep mourning, all while sitting in her black-draped sitting room and consuming her tea and cakes with evident satisfaction. After his departure, Catherine had felt the walls closing in, the black crepe seeming to tighten around her like grave clothes, and she had announced to a startled Mary that she required fresh air immediately. Propriety be damned. Now she walked along the gravelled paths of the park, still dressed in her widow's weeds, but with her veil thrown back so she might actually see the world around her, and what she saw was revelation. Spring was arriving despite the lingering cold, despite the grey skies and occasional spits of rain that characterized an English March. Crocuses pushed through the hard earth in defiant clusters of purple and gold and white, their delicate petals brave against the possibility of frost. Early daffodils nodded in the breeze, and the trees showed the first hint of green buds on branches that had been bare and black throughout the long winter. Catherine had not realized how starved she had been for color, for life, until this moment when even the pale spring sunshine seemed almost painfully bright after months in dimly lit rooms. The park was not crowded at this hour, too early for the fashionable promenade, but late enough that nursemaids with their charges had begun to appear, and Catherine found herself gravitating toward the quieter paths near the Serpentine, where she might walk without attracting undue attention. Her black attire drew occasional glances from passers-by, some sympathetic, others merely curious, but most people had the grace to look away and allow her the privacy of her grief, real or performed. She had been walking for perhaps 20 minutes when she saw him, a tall figure in dark clothing standing before a wooden bench that overlooked a small ornamental pond. From a distance she could not make out his features, but something in his posture suggested solemnity, a stillness that spoke of private ritual. Catherine slowed her pace, not wishing to intrude, and was about to turn down another path when she saw him place something on the bench, a splash of vivid color that drew her eye even from yards away. Red roses, a dozen of them at least, their petals brilliant against the weathered wood of the bench and the grey-green backdrop of the park. The man stood for a moment longer, his head bowed as if in prayer or remembrance, then turned and walked away with long, purposeful strides, moving in the opposite direction from where Catherine stood. She remained motionless, watching his retreating figure, something about the gesture he had just performed touching a place in her chest that had been numb for months. There was such tenderness in it, such private devotion, the act of a man who loved deeply and remembered faithfully. Without quite deciding to do so, Catherine found herself walking toward the bench, drawn by those impossible roses, their color so saturated and alive that they seemed to pulse with vitality against the muted tones of early spring. As she drew closer, she saw there was a small card tucked among the stems, and though she knew it was terribly improper to read what was clearly a private message, she could not resist leaning down to see what it said. The handwriting was bold and masculine, the ink black against cream-colored cardstock, and the message was brief but achingly sincere. For my beloved Margaret, who loved this spot. You are not forgotten. It was signed simply with the letter A. Catherine straightened, feeling as though she had glimpsed something sacred, an expression of the kind of love she had once believed existed only in novels. The roses seemed to glow in the weak sunlight that had begun to break through the clouds, each petal perfect, clearly chosen with care from a hothouse where such blooms were cultivated at great expense. This was no casual gesture, but a deliberate act of remembrance, and Catherine felt tears prick her eyes, moved by the beauty of devotion that persisted beyond death. She was so absorbed in her thoughts that she did not hear the footsteps on the gravel path behind her until a voice spoke, startling her badly. "Forgive me," the voice said, deep and cultured with a note of surprise. "I did not expect anyone to be here." Catherine turned quickly, her heart hammering, and found herself facing the man she had seen moments before, now returned and standing just a few feet away. He was perhaps in his mid-30s, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair touched with silver at the temples, his features aristocratic and severe, though not unkind. He wore black, as she did, though his attire was less ostentatiously mourning than hers, a simple black coat and trousers that might have been worn for any somber occasion. His eyes, she noticed, were a striking grey, the colour of winter skies, and they regarded her with a mixture of wariness and something else she could not quite name. "I apologize," Catherine said quickly, taking a step back from the bench and the roses. "I should not have intruded. I was merely walking, and saw the flowers, and they were so beautiful that I—" She trailed off, aware that she was babbling, that her cheeks were flushing with embarrassment at being caught reading his private message. The man's expression softened slightly, and he moved forward to retrieve a pair of black leather gloves from the bench, which Catherine now realized must have been what he had returned for. "Most people rush past anything that does not concern them," he said, his tone less sharp than his words might suggest. "You are the first person I have encountered here who stopped to notice." Catherine found herself speaking before she could think better of it. "I find I notice more now. Grief has a way of making you see what others miss." The words hung between them, an admission she had not intended to make, and she saw something shift in his expression, recognition perhaps, or simple understanding. He looked at her more carefully, taking in her widow's weeds, the black veil thrown back to reveal her face, the prayer book she carried more from habit than devotion. His own features softened further, the wariness giving way to something approaching compassion. "You have suffered a loss," he said, and it was statement rather than question. "Yes." Catherine's voice was barely above a whisper. "My husband passed in November." There was a pause, during which a breeze rustled the trees around them and sent a shower of early cherry blossoms drifting across the path like snow. The man seemed to be considering something, weighing whether to continue the conversation or make his excuses and depart. Catherine found herself hoping he would stay, though she could not have explained why. The simple fact of speaking to someone who understood grief, who performed his own private rituals of remembrance, was more comfort than she had found in all the formal condolences and proper visits of the past months. "My wife passed 2 years ago," he said finally, his voice carrying a weight of emotion that he did not attempt to disguise. "They say mourning ends, but I am not certain that is true." The admission was unexpected in its honesty, and Catherine felt something in her chest loosen, a tightness she had not fully acknowledged until this moment when it began to ease. She looked at him, this stranger who was not quite a stranger, and spoke the truth she had been circling around for weeks. Perhaps mourning ends when we finally mourn the right things. He stared at her, clearly startled by the observation, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Around them, the park continued its afternoon rhythms, children calling to each other in the distance, birds singing their territorial claims in the budding trees, the soft whisper of wind through new grass. But in the small space where they stood, there was stillness, a pocket of quiet understanding that felt almost sacred. "I am Alexander Blackwood," he said at length, offering a slight bow. "Duke of Thornfield, though I confess titles seem rather insignificant in a place like this." "Catherine Ashworth," she replied, dropping into a curtsy that felt ridiculous in its formality, given the intimacy of the conversation they had just shared. "Though I suppose I should say the widow of Lord Edmund Ashworth, as that seems to be my primary identity at present." A hint of a smile touched Alexander's mouth, the expression transforming his severe features into something approaching warmth. "Identity is a curious thing in grief, is it not? We become defined by our loss rather than by ourselves." Catherine felt tears threaten again, moved by the simple understanding in his words. "Yes, exactly that. I feel sometimes as if I have ceased to exist except as a memorial to someone else." He nodded slowly, his grey eyes holding hers with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable, but instead felt steadying, anchoring. "Margaret, my wife. She loved this bench. She would sit here for hours with a book, watching the ducks on the pond and feeding them bits of bread she brought from the kitchen. The staff thought her quite mad, a duchess sitting on a public bench like a common girl, but she did not care a fig for propriety." His voice had softened with memory, and Catherine could hear the genuine affection there, the love that persisted beyond death. "She sounds wonderful," Catherine said, meaning it. To have inspired such devotion, such faithful remembrance, she must have been extraordinary. She was, Alexander agreed simply, then seemed to shake himself slightly, as if remembering where he was and to whom he was speaking. "But I am keeping you from your walk, Mrs. Ashworth. Forgive me for imposing on your time." "Not at all," Catherine said quickly, surprising herself with her vehemence. "That is, I have found this conversation more sustaining than any I have had in months. There is such relief in speaking honestly rather than performing the expected platitudes." Alexander's expression grew thoughtful as he studied her face, and Catherine felt seen in a way she had not experienced since before her marriage. Perhaps never. "You understand," he said softly. "So few people do. They expect grief to be tidy, to follow prescribed forms and timelines. But it is messy and complicated, and often contradictory." "Yes," Catherine breathed, feeling as though he had articulated something she had not been able to name. "Exactly, yes." They stood for a moment longer, the red roses brilliant between them, a reminder of the love that had brought Alexander to this spot, and the loneliness that had driven Catherine to walk through the park in defiance of convention. The weak sunlight strengthened slightly, gilding the scene with pale gold, and Catherine felt something she had not experienced in years. Not happiness precisely, but possibility, the sense that the world might hold more than she had allowed herself to imagine. "I walk here most afternoons," Alexander said, his tone casual but his eyes intent. "Weather permitting. If you should happen to pass this way again, I would not be averse to further conversation." Catherine felt her heart lift in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. "I often walk in the afternoons myself," she replied, matching his careful tone. "It would be pleasant to have company, should our paths happen to cross." They parted then with formal bows and curtsies that belied the connection that had formed between them, and Catherine continued her walk through the park with steps that felt lighter than they had in months. When she glanced back once, she saw Alexander still standing by the bench, the red roses vivid against his dark clothing, watching her retreating figure with an expression she could not quite read. That night, lying in her bed in the black-draped house, Catherine found herself thinking not of Edmund and his betrayals, but of a man who brought roses to a park bench, who spoke of grief with honesty and understanding, who had looked at her and seen not a convenient fiction, but a real woman worthy of genuine conversation, and for the first time since November, she fell asleep with something very much like hope warming her chest. April arrived with a flourish of warmth and colour that seemed to mock the rigid strictures of mourning, and Catherine found herself returning to Hyde Park with a frequency that would have scandalized Lord Thomas Ashworth had he known, which he did not, for she had become adept at evading the watchful eyes of those who sought to keep her confined to her black-draped prison. The first few encounters with Alexander Blackwood were carefully orchestrated to appear accidental, both of them maintaining the fiction that they simply happened to walk in the park at the same hour each afternoon, that their meetings by the bench with its memorial roses were mere coincidence rather than deliberate arrangement. But by the third week of April, they had abandoned the pretense, acknowledging openly that they sought each other's company, and finding in that honesty a freedom neither had experienced in years. Alexander was unlike any man Catherine had known, certainly nothing like Edmund, with his careless charm and underlying indifference, nor like the other gentlemen of her acquaintance, who treated women as decorative creatures to be admired but never truly engaged. When Alexander asked her opinion on a matter, he listened to her answer with genuine attention, his grey eyes focused on her face as if her thoughts had real value. They discussed books and politics, art and philosophy, ranging across subjects that Catherine had been taught were unsuitable for mixed company, but which Alexander introduced with the easy assumption that her mind was equal to his own. He told her about his estates in Northumberland, about the challenges of agricultural reform and the responsibilities of his seat in the House of Lords, speaking to her not as a pretty audience, but as an intellectual equal whose perspective he actively sought. In turn, Catherine found herself speaking more freely than she had in years, perhaps ever, articulating opinions she had kept hidden even from herself during her marriage, when silence and compliance had been her only shields. One afternoon in late April, as they walked together through the park under skies that threatened rain, Alexander asked the question Catherine had been both dreading and expecting. "You do not speak of your husband the way most widows do," he said, his tone careful but direct. "Were you content in your marriage, Mrs. Ashworth?" Catherine felt her step falter, and for a moment she considered offering the expected platitude, the fiction of satisfied duty that society demanded. But something in Alexander's expression, open and without judgment, made her choose truth instead. "I was dutiful," she said slowly, testing the words even as she spoke them. "I believed that would be sufficient. I was wrong." Alexander nodded thoughtfully, not pressing for elaboration, and Catherine felt a rush of gratitude for his restraint. After a pause, he spoke again, his voice carrying a weight of its own revelation. "Margaret and I were genuinely happy. I thought I would never feel joy again after she passed. Yet somehow in your company I find myself less burdened." The admission hung between them, significant in its vulnerability, and Catherine felt her heart constrict with an emotion she could not quite name. It was pleasure at being valued, certainly, but also a sharp awareness of the difference between her experience of marriage and his. Alexander had loved his wife deeply, mourned her truly, while Catherine wore the costume of grief for a man who had regarded her as little more than a financial convenience. The contrast should have made her feel diminished. Yet somehow Alexander's honesty elevated rather than cheapened her own experience, validating her right to complex feelings about Edmund's death. "Is it wrong?" she asked quietly. "To be glad one's cage door has opened, even if the reason is tragic?" Alexander stopped walking and turned to face her fully, his expression grave but kind. "I think it would be wrong to pretend feelings you do not have," he said. "Honesty, even uncomfortable honesty, has more value than performed sentiment." His words released something in Catherine's chest, a knot of guilt she had been carrying since the funeral, and she felt tears prick her eyes even as she smiled. "Thank you," she whispered. "You cannot know how much I needed to hear that." As April gave way to May, their friendship deepened and expanded beyond the park. Alexander invited Catherine to accompany him to the British Museum, where they spent an entire afternoon examining the Elgin marbles and debating the ethics of their acquisition, Catherine arguing passionately that beauty did not justify theft, while Alexander played devil's advocate with evident enjoyment of her spirited defense. He introduced her to his favorite bookshop on Charing Cross Road, a cramped establishment that smelled of leather and old paper, where the proprietor knew him by name and seemed unsurprised when the Duke spent over an hour helping Catherine select volumes of poetry and philosophy, insisting on purchasing them for her over her protests. Most significantly, he invited her to take tea with his sister, Lady Helena Pritchard, at her home in Belgravia. A gesture that signaled his friendship with Catherine was not something he felt obliged to hide from his family. Lady Helena proved to be a revelation, a woman in her early 40s with her brother's grey eyes and a forthright manner that reminded Catherine powerfully of the novels she had been reading in secret for years, heroines who spoke their minds and refused to be constrained by convention. Over tea and delicate cakes, Helena asked Catherine direct questions about her interests and opinions, responding to her answers with enthusiastic agreement or spirited disagreement, but always with respect for Catherine's right to hold her own views. When Catherine mentioned her love of reading, Helena immediately insisted on lending her several volumes from her own library, including a scandalously progressive tract on women's education that would have given Lord Thomas Ashworth apoplexy had he known of its existence. "My brother tells me you have a fine mind," Helena said as Catherine prepared to depart, her eyes twinkling with warmth. "I am delighted to discover he has not exaggerated. You must come again soon. We shall have such conversations." Catherine left the Pritchard residence, feeling as though she had been given a gift more precious than any material object, the validation of her own intelligence and worth by people whose opinion she had come to value deeply. Yet even as her friendship with Alexander brought her more happiness than she had known in years, Catherine was acutely aware of the whispers beginning to circulate through society. The Ashworth widow had been seen walking in Hyde Park with the Duke of Thornfield, not once, but repeatedly. They had been observed together at the British Museum, their conversation so animated as to border on improper. Lady Pemberton, who seemed to take particular interest in Catherine's activities, made sure to mention at every opportunity that two people in mourning ought to maintain more rigid isolation, that such public friendship suggested a lack of proper feeling. The criticism stung, not because Catherine believed it justified, but because she knew the power of social censure to destroy a woman's reputation and prospects. Mary, her loyal maid, reported the gossip faithfully, her expression worried as she helped Catherine dress each morning. "They are saying terrible things, ma'am," Mary said one morning in early May. that you are disrespecting Lord Edmund's memory, that the Duke is taking advantage of your vulnerable state. Let them say what they wish." Catherine replied with more confidence than she felt. "I have worn black for a man who never valued me. I will not also sacrifice the first genuine friendship I have known to appease the judgment of hypocrites." But her words were braver than her heart, and that afternoon when she met Alexander in the park, she found herself voicing her concerns. He listened carefully as she explained the whispers, the warnings from Mary, the subtle cut she had received from an acquaintance who had once been cordial. When she finished, Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his expression troubled. "I would not have your reputation damaged for the world," he said finally. "If our friendship causes you harm, perhaps we should." "No," Catherine interrupted, surprising herself with her vehemence. "Please, I cannot bear the thought of returning to that suffocating isolation. Your friendship has been the only light in months of darkness." Alexander's face softened, and he reached out as if to take her hand before remembering propriety and letting his arm fall. "Then we shall be more discreet," he said. "But I will not give up your company, Catherine, not unless you ask it of me directly." The use of her given name, which had become natural between them over the past weeks, sent a flutter through her chest. She looked at him, this man who had entered her life so unexpectedly, who had shown her what it meant to be valued and respected, and felt something shift inside her, a recognition she was not quite ready to name. "I do not ask it," she said softly. "I could never ask it." It was shortly after this conversation that Catherine made her first small rebellion against the strictures of mourning. She instructed Mary to put away the full black bombazine gowns and bring out dresses of dark grey silk, still sombre and respectful, but no longer the absolute black that society demanded. The change was subtle, but Mary's eyes widened with approval as she helped Catherine into the grey gown, and when Catherine looked at herself in the mirror, finally uncovered now that she had decided propriety could be moderately damned, she saw a woman beginning to emerge from shadow. When she appeared at the park that afternoon, Alexander's expression told her he noticed immediately. "Grey suits you," he said simply, but the warmth in his eyes conveyed more than his words. "It feels like rebellion," Catherine admitted. "Dangerous and exhilarating in equal measure." "Good," Alexander replied. "You have been confined too long." As May progressed and spring reached its full glory, Catherine found herself laughing more freely, speaking more boldly, existing more fully than she had in the entirety of her marriage. She and Alexander established a rhythm to their meetings, afternoons in the park when weather permitted, visits to museums and galleries, occasional tea with Helena, who had become a friend in her own right. They spoke of everything and nothing, sharing childhood memories and adult disappointments, debating the merits of various poets and the deficiencies of Parliament, falling into comfortable silences that felt as intimate as conversation. Alexander told her about Margaret, about their courtship and marriage, and Catherine listened without the jealousy she might have expected, finding instead a deep appreciation for the love he described. Margaret had been vivacious and bold, passionate about causes from abolition to education reform, unafraid to use her position as Duchess to advance her beliefs. "She sounds extraordinary," Catherine said one afternoon, as they sat on the bench that had been Margaret's favourite spot. "You must miss her terribly." "I do," Alexander agreed, his voice carrying the weight of honest grief. "But I am learning that missing someone and moving forward need not be mutually exclusive. For weeks I felt guilty for enjoying our conversations, as if finding pleasure in your company was somehow a betrayal of Margaret's memory." "And now?" Catherine prompted gently. "Now I believe Margaret would have liked you tremendously," Alexander said, turning to look at Catherine with an expression of such warmth that it stole her breath. She always said I needed someone who would challenge my assumptions and refuse to let me become pompous. You do both with remarkable frequency. Catherine felt heat rise to her cheeks, pleasure and something deeper warming her from within. I have learned that you respond well to challenge, Your Grace. She used his title teasingly, as had become their habit when the conversation grew too serious or too intimate. Alexander, he corrected automatically, though they both knew she would continue to alternate between his title and given name as suited her mood. And yes, I find I do respond well to challenge, particularly from a woman whose intelligence I have come to admire profoundly. The moment stretched between them, weighted with meaning neither was quite ready to articulate, and then Alexander stood abruptly, offering his hand to help Catherine rise. "Walk with me," he said. "There is something I wish to show you." He led her to a section of the park she had not visited before, where a small rose garden was beginning to bloom, early varieties opening their petals to the May sunshine. The colors were extraordinary after months of black and gray and muted tones, reds and pinks and whites and yellows, each bloom perfect and impossibly vivid. Catherine stopped at the entrance to the garden, overwhelmed by the sheer abundance of beauty, and felt tears slip down her cheeks before she could prevent them. "I have not allowed myself to see color," she said, her voice breaking. "I did not realize how starved I was for it." Alexander stood beside her, not touching but close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence. "We deny ourselves so much in the name of duty and propriety," he said quietly. "Sometimes we forget that life continues, that beauty persists, that we are permitted to experience joy, even in grief." Catherine turned to him, this man who had brought color back into her grey world, who had reminded her that she was more than a convenient fiction or a memorial to someone else's life. "Thank you," she said, meaning it for so much more than just the roses. For the first time in years, Catherine Ashworth felt fully alive, awake to possibility and open to whatever might come, even as she knew that the path forward was fraught with complication and risk, even as society's whispers grew louder and her own heart grew more entangled with a man who still loved the wife he had lost. She could not bring herself to retreat back into the safety of isolation, for she had tasted friendship and intellectual communion and the heady pleasure of being truly seen, and she would not willingly return to the darkness, whatever the cost. Late May brought unseasonably warm weather to London, the kind of heavy heat that made the city feel languid and drowsy, and it was on such an afternoon that Alexander extended an invitation that would alter the careful equilibrium Catherine had established over the past weeks. They were walking through the park, Catherine in a gown of deep charcoal grey that represented another small step away from full mourning, when Alexander mentioned almost casually that he would be honoured if she would visit his London residence, that there was something he wished to show her, something important. The invitation was significant in ways that required no explanation, for a widow visiting a widower's private home went well beyond the bounds of their already questionable friendship, but Catherine found herself accepting before she could consider the implications, drawn by the obvious importance Alexander placed on whatever he wished to share. The following afternoon, she arrived at the imposing townhouse in Mayfair that served as the Duke of Thornfield's London seat, her heart beating uncomfortably fast beneath her corset as a footman ushered her into an entrance hall of breathtaking grandeur. Marble columns soared toward a painted ceiling depicting some classical scene. A magnificent staircase curved upward in a sweep of polished mahogany. And everywhere Catherine looked, she saw evidence of wealth and taste that made her own modest circumstances seem almost shabby by comparison. Alexander appeared at the top of the stairs, descending with the easy grace of a man completely comfortable in such surroundings, and his smile when he saw her was warm enough to ease some of her nervousness. "Thank you for coming," he said, taking her hand in greeting and holding it perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary. "I know this is somewhat irregular, but I wanted you to see this in private, without the eyes of society watching and judging." He led her up the grand staircase and along a corridor hung with family portraits, generations of Blackwoods staring down with expressions ranging from stern disapproval to benign interest, until they reached a door at the far end of the hallway. Alexander paused before opening it, his hand on the ornate handle, and Catherine saw something flicker across his face that might have been uncertainty or perhaps pain. "This was Margaret's favorite room," he said quietly. "I have kept it much as she left it. It seemed important, somehow, to preserve what she loved." He opened the door and Catherine stepped into a space that stole her breath, not with its grandeur, though it was certainly grand, but with its beauty and the overwhelming sense of presence that seemed to permeate every surface. The gallery, for such it clearly was, stretched the length of the townhouse, its walls covered in silk of deep blue-green that caught the afternoon light streaming through tall windows overlooking the gardens below. Paintings hung in careful arrangement, not the formal portraits one might expect, but rather a collection that spoke of personal passion and refined taste, landscapes and still lifes, classical scenes and contemporary works, each piece clearly chosen for its own merit rather than to impress visitors. Sculptures occupied pedestals placed at intervals along the room, busts of philosophers and statesmen. A marble Venus that blushed pink in the warm light. But it was the portrait at the far end of the gallery that drew Catherine's eye and held it, a life-sized painting of a woman who could only be Margaret Blackwood, and Catherine felt her steps slow as she approached it, drawn and repelled in equal measure. Margaret had been beautiful, there was no other word for it, though her beauty was of a vibrant, animated sort that the portrait captured imperfectly, suggesting that in life she must have been even more striking. Dark hair fell in artful curls around a face of classical proportions, high cheekbones and full lips curved in a smile that suggested intelligence and humor. But it was her eyes that dominated the portrait, large and dark, and filled with such life that Catherine felt they followed her as she moved closer, assessing her with an intensity that made her want to look away. The artist had captured her in a gown of deep crimson, scandalously bright for a formal portrait, and around her neck was a magnificent ruby necklace that drew the eye to the graceful column of her throat. She stood in a garden, roses blooming extravagantly around her, one hand extended as if offering a bloom to the viewer, and the whole composition radiated warmth and vitality and confidence. This was a woman who had known her own worth, who had moved through the world secure in her beauty and position, and the love of those around her. Catherine felt something cold and hard settle in her stomach as she stared at the portrait. A recognition that was both revelation and devastation. She had been falling in love with Alexander Blackwood, she realized with painful clarity. Perhaps had been since that first meeting in the park when he had shown her kindness and understanding. Certainly had been during the weeks of friendship that had opened her world and shown her what genuine companionship could be. But standing before this portrait, seeing the evidence of Margaret's extraordinary presence, Catherine understood with crushing certainty that she could never compete with such a memory. How could she, plain Catherine Ashworth, who had been deemed adequate for a gambling wastrel but nothing more, how could she possibly measure against a woman who had been duchess and beauty and force of nature all combined? Alexander came to stand beside her, his eyes on the portrait with an expression Catherine recognized as love, pure and undiluted by time or loss. and when he spoke his voice carried such reverence that it felt like a knife to her heart. "She had the most extraordinary spirit," he said softly. "Fearless, passionate about life. She cared nothing for what others thought if she believed a cause was just. The ruby necklace in the portrait, she wore it to a state dinner, and scandalized half the court because she had sold the matching bracelet and earrings to fund a school for working-class girls. The Queen was not amused, but Margaret simply laughed and said if Her Majesty wished to fund education herself, Margaret would happily wear the complete set next time." His voice held such affection, such pride in her audacity, that Catherine felt tears prick her eyes. "She sounds remarkable," she managed, her own voice sounding thin and strained to her ears. "You were fortunate to have such a love." "Few people ever experience it." Alexander nodded, still gazing at the portrait as if seeing not paint and canvas, but the living woman. "I was a better man because of her," he said. "She challenged me constantly, refused to let me hide behind my title or privilege. She believed the aristocracy had obligations that went beyond maintaining estates and attending Parliament, that we had a duty to use our positions to improve the lives of those less fortunate. Half my friends thought her dangerously radical, but I think she may have been simply ahead of her time." Catherine felt something breaking inside her chest, fracturing into pieces that she knew would never quite fit back together correctly. This was what Alexander had loved, what he continued to love even 2 years after Margaret's death. And how could Catherine's quiet intelligence and careful opinions possibly compare to such vibrant conviction? She was no beauty, had no great causes that fired her passion, possessed no fortune or position that might make her valuable beyond her own modest person. She was simply a woman who had been unloved by her husband, and was now, she realized, doomed to love a man who had already given his heart away completely and irretrievably. "I should go," Catherine said abruptly, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I have stayed too long. It is not proper." Alexander turned to her, confusion evident in his expression, and Catherine saw the moment he registered her distress, though she knew he could not possibly understand its source. "Catherine," he said, reaching out as if to take her hand before stopping himself. "I hope I have not upset you by bringing you here. I wanted you to see this, to understand what Margaret meant to me, to us. I value our friendship immensely, and I thought—" Friendship. The word landed like a blow, confirmation of what Catherine had already known, but somehow hoped against hope, might not be true. "Of course," she said, forcing her voice to steadiness. "Of course, Your Grace, I am honored by your trust. But truly I must go. My maid will be wondering what has become of me." She was already moving toward the door, desperate to escape before the tears threatening at the corners of her eyes could fall, before Alexander could see just how thoroughly his revelation had devastated her. He followed, his longer stride allowing him to reach the door first, and for a moment they stood too close in the doorway. Close enough that Catherine could see the concern in his grey eyes. Close enough that she could smell the faint scent of sandalwood that clung to his clothing. "Please," he said quietly, "tell me what I have done wrong. How have I distressed you?" "Nothing," Catherine lied, the words scraping her throat raw. "You have done nothing wrong. I am simply tired, and the heat is rather oppressive, and I find I need air. Let me call for my carriage." Alexander offered. "I will escort you home." "No," Catherine said too quickly, too emphatically. "No, I prefer to walk. Please, Your Grace, just let me go." She saw hurt flash across his features at her use of his title, at the formal distance she was deliberately placing between them, but she could not help it. could not bear another moment in this house that was shrine to a woman she could never hope to equal. Alexander stepped back, allowing her passage, and Catherine fled down the corridor and the grand staircase, barely pausing to collect her bonnet and gloves from the footman before escaping into the street. The afternoon heat struck her like a physical force, the air thick and still, carrying the scents of horse manure and coal smoke, and humanity pressed too close together. London in summer with all its glamour stripped away to reveal the grimy reality beneath. Catherine walked blindly, not caring where her feet carried her, only needing distance from that portrait with its knowing eyes and vibrant beauty, from Alexander's reverent voice describing a love so perfect it could never be replicated or replaced. She found herself eventually in a small square, one of those pocket gardens that dotted London's wealthy neighbourhoods, and sank onto a bench beneath a plane tree whose broad leaves provided merciful shade. Only then did she allow the tears to fall, pressing her gloved hands to her face as if she could physically hold back the sobs that tore from her throat. What had she expected, she asked herself bitterly, that a man who had loved so deeply, so completely, would somehow transfer that devotion to her, plain Catherine, who brought nothing extraordinary to the table beyond a willingness to listen and a modest education. She had been a fool to hope, to imagine that the friendship they shared might develop into something more. Alexander had shown her kindness because he was a kind man, had enjoyed her company because she was presentable and moderately intelligent, but that was all it was and all it could ever be. How could she compete with a ghost, especially a ghost as perfect as Margaret Blackwood had clearly been? The woman in that portrait had been everything Catherine was not, beautiful and bold and passionate, a force of nature who had made the world bend to her vision. Catherine was merely dutiful, quiet, content to read her novels and keep her opinions safely hidden, a woman who had been deemed adequate for a wastrel's purposes, but who had never inspired genuine devotion in anyone. The comparison was not just unfavorable, it was devastating, a reminder that Catherine had always been second choice, second best, the one selected when no better option presented itself. She sat in that small garden for over an hour, until the tears finally stopped, and the sun began its descent toward evening. Until she felt empty and hollowed out, but at least capable of returning home without completely falling apart. When she finally rose and made her way back to Ashworth House, Mary took one look at her face and asked no questions, simply helped her out of her grey gown and into a loose wrapper, brought her tea that Catherine did not drink, and sat quietly in the corner doing needlework, while Catherine lay on her bed staring at the ceiling. That evening, a note arrived from Alexander, his handwriting bold on cream-coloured paper. Catherine stared at it for a long moment before opening it, steeling herself for whatever it might contain. The message was brief, but carried a weight of concern that made fresh tears prick at her eyes. "My dear Mrs. Ashworth, I fear I caused you distress this afternoon through my thoughtlessness. Please know that was never my intention. I hold our friendship in the highest regard and would be devastated to think I had damaged it through carelessness. If I have offended you, please grant me the opportunity to apologize properly. I remain, as always, your devoted friend, Alexander Blackwood." Catherine read the note 3 times, each reading making her heart ache more profoundly. Your devoted friend. There it was again, that word that defined the limits of what they could be to each other. She folded the note carefully and placed it in the drawer of her writing desk, where she kept Alexander's previous letters, a small collection of correspondence that she knew she should probably burn but could not bring herself to destroy. She did not reply that evening, nor the next day. Unsure what she could possibly say that would not reveal too much or demand what he could not give. And so began Catherine's withdrawal, a pulling back from the friendship that had come to mean everything to her, a retreat into the safety of isolation, where her heart might at least be protected from further damage, even if it meant surrendering the only joy she had known in years. She told herself it was necessary, that continuing to see Alexander would only deepen her attachment to a man who could never return her feelings, that it was better to end things now before she became so entangled that escape would be impossible. But even as she made these rational arguments to herself, Catherine felt the walls of her black-draped prison closing in once more, the color draining from her world as surely as if spring had reversed itself and winter returned. And she mourned not for Edmund, who had never deserved her grief, but for Alexander, who had shown her what life could be, and whom she now had to release, for both their sakes, even if it broke her heart completely in the process. June arrived with a brilliance that seemed almost cruel in its beauty, the kind of perfect summer weather that London so rarely enjoyed, days of cloudless blue skies and warm breezes that carried the scent of roses from every garden. And Catherine Ashworth retreated from it all as if the sunshine itself was an accusation. The sitting room that she had begun to brighten over the past weeks, removing some of the oppressive black crepe and allowing light to filter through partially opened curtains, was once again shrouded in darkness, the mirrors recovered, the windows draped, every surface that had begun to show color now muted beneath layers of mourning fabric. She had instructed Mary to pack away the grey gowns, those small rebellions against convention that had marked her emergence from grief's prison, and return the full black bombazine to her wardrobe, each heavy dress a punishment she felt she deserved for the sin of hoping, of imagining that she might be worthy of something more than duty and obligation. The transformation back to strict mourning had taken only a day, but the emotional retreat had begun the moment she fled Alexander's gallery, running from the portrait of a woman so perfect that even death could not diminish her hold on the man Catherine loved. For she did love him, Catherine acknowledged in the privacy of her darkened room, loved him with an intensity that frightened her precisely because it was so different from anything she had felt for Edmund. What she felt for Alexander was not the resigned acceptance of a contractual arrangement, but rather a deep recognition of kindred spirits, an appreciation for his intelligence and kindness, a longing for his company that had become as necessary as breathing. And that was precisely why she had to end it, had to withdraw before her feelings grew so entangled that extraction would be impossible. Better to bury herself now, to return to the safe numbness of mourning, than to stand forever in the shadow of Margaret Blackwood, comparing herself to a ghost and finding herself inevitably wanting. The first note from Alexander arrived the morning after her visit to his gallery, delivered by a footman in Thornfield livery who waited expectantly for a reply that Catherine could not bring herself to write. She held the cream-coloured envelope in her hands for a long time, feeling its weight, knowing that opening it would only make her resolution harder to maintain. Finally, she broke the seal and read his words, his concern evident in every carefully chosen phrase, his confusion palpable, his desire to make amends for an offence he did not understand, and which Catherine could not explain touching her, even as it deepened her pain. She placed the letter in her desk drawer unopened and did not reply. A second note arrived the following day, then a third, each one growing slightly more desperate in tone, though still maintaining the careful courtesy that characterized all of Alexander's communications. He begged for the opportunity to see her, to understand what he had done wrong, to repair whatever breach had opened between them. He spoke of missing their conversations, of the park bench that seemed empty without her presence, of his sister Helena, who had asked after her with genuine concern. Each letter was a knife to Catherine's heart, but she steeled herself against the pain and left them all unanswered, knowing that any response would weaken her resolve. that hearing his voice or seeing his face would shatter the fragile walls she was building around her wounded heart. Mary watched these proceedings with increasing distress, her normally cheerful face drawn with worry as she helped Catherine dress each morning in the hated black gowns, as she served tea that went untouched, as she picked up the unopened letters that accumulated on Catherine's writing desk like accusations. For nearly a week the maid held her tongue, but finally, on a morning when Catherine had refused to eat breakfast and sat staring blankly at the covered windows, Mary's composure broke. "Ma'am," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut through Catherine's fog of misery. "Begging your pardon, but you are burying yourself alive just when you had found a reason to live." Catherine turned slowly to look at her maid. This woman who had been her only true companion through 5 years of loveless marriage and 3 months of false mourning, and felt her carefully maintained composure crack slightly. "You do not understand, Mary," she said, her voice hollow. "You cannot understand." "Then explain it to me," Mary challenged, her hands on her hips, in a posture that would have been insubordinate from any other servant, but which Catherine recognized as genuine concern. "Explain why you are throwing away your happiness, why you refuse to see a gentleman who clearly values you, why you have returned to this tomb when you are finally beginning to live." Catherine felt tears prick her eyes, hot and insistent, and she blinked them back with effort. "Better to bury myself than to stand in the shadow of a dead woman for the rest of my life," she said, the words tearing from her throat like broken glass. "Better this loneliness than the agony of loving someone who can never love me in return, who has already given his heart so completely to another that there is nothing left for anyone else." Understanding dawned in Mary's eyes, followed by a sympathy that was somehow worse than judgment would have been. "Oh, ma'am," she said softly, "you have fallen in love with the Duke." It was not a question, and Catherine saw no point in denying what had become painfully obvious. "Yes," she whispered, "God help me, yes. And he loves his wife, his perfect, beautiful, passionate wife, who was everything I am not and can never be. How can I compete with a memory, Mary? How can I stand beside him knowing I am second choice, knowing he sees me only as a friend because I am here and she is not?" Mary came to kneel beside Catherine's chair, taking her mistress's cold hands in her own warm ones, a breach of propriety that both women ignored. "Did he say that, ma'am?" Mary asked gently. "Did the Duke tell you that you were second choice, that he could never care for you?" "No," Catherine admitted. "But I saw the portrait, Mary. I saw how he looked at her painting, heard how he spoke of her. She was extraordinary, and I am merely ordinary. I cannot ask him to settle for less than what he had." "You are not less," Mary said fiercely. "You are different, and there is no shame in that. Perhaps the Duke needs different. Perhaps he needs someone who understands quiet strength rather than loud passion, someone who has survived her own trials and emerged with grace intact." But Catherine shook her head, unable to accept comfort that felt like false hope. "You are kind, but you did not see. You did not hear the reverence in his voice. He will love her forever. And I cannot bear to be a poor substitute, a placeholder for a ghost." The days that followed were among the darkest Catherine could remember, worse in some ways than the immediate aftermath of Edmund's death, because then she had been numb, protected by shock and the absence of real grief. Now she felt everything with excruciating clarity, the loss of Alexander's friendship like an amputation, a phantom pain that persisted even though she knew the limb was gone. She stopped going to the park entirely, afraid of accidentally encountering him, afraid that her resolve would crumble at the sight of his face. She refused all social invitations, the few that came to a woman in mourning, and spent her days in the darkened sitting room reading the same pages of books without comprehending a single word. The house, which had briefly felt less oppressive during her weeks of friendship with Alexander, closed around her once more like a coffin, and Catherine felt herself disappearing into it, becoming nothing more than a shadow in black, a ghost haunting her own life. Alexander's letters continued to arrive with painful regularity, and Catherine made herself read each one, even though doing so felt like pressing on a bruise, needing to feel the pain as penance for her foolishness. His confusion gave way to concern, his concern to something that read almost like anguish, though Catherine told herself she was imagining the depth of feeling she wanted to see in his carefully chosen words. One letter in particular nearly broke her resolve entirely, arriving nearly 2 weeks into her self-imposed isolation. "My dear Catherine," it began, abandoning the formal Mrs. Ashworth he had used in previous correspondence. "If I have offended you, please grant me the opportunity to make amends. Your absence leaves a void I cannot adequately express. I find myself walking in the park each afternoon, hoping against hope that I might encounter you, that I might have the chance to understand what has driven you away. Helena asks after you constantly, worried that some illness has befallen you. I confess I share her concern, for the woman I knew would not retreat without cause. Whatever I have done, whatever thoughtless word or deed has caused this breach between us, please know that it was unintentional, and that I would do anything in my power to repair it. Our friendship has come to mean more to me than I have the words to express, and its loss leaves me profoundly diminished. I remain, always yours in devoted friendship, Alexander." Catherine read the letter until she had memorized every word, until the paper was soft from handling, and still she could not bring herself to reply. "Devoted friendship," he wrote, and those 2 words were both balm and poison, offering the comfort of his regard while simultaneously making clear the limits of what he could give. She wanted more than friendship, needed more, and accepting less would be a slow torture that would eventually destroy whatever remained of her spirit. Better a clean break now than a lingering death of hope deferred and love unreturned. Outside her windows, summer blazed in full glory, the longest days of the year bringing light that persisted well into evening. But inside Catherine's sitting room, it might as well have been the depths of winter. The flowers that Alexander had sent during their friendship, bright arrangements that Mary had placed throughout the room, had long since wilted and been removed, leaving only empty vases as reminders of what had been lost. The books he had given her, volumes of poetry and philosophy carefully selected to match her interests, sat unread on the shelf, too painful to look at and too precious to discard. The grey gowns hung in her wardrobe like abandoned dreams, and Catherine found herself sometimes standing before them in the darkness, running her fingers over the soft fabric and remembering the woman she had briefly been, alive and engaged and open to possibility. Mary tried various strategies to draw Catherine out of her self-imposed exile, suggesting walks in the early morning when the park would be empty, proposing visits to museums or galleries at times when they were unlikely to encounter anyone of consequence, even offering to arrange tea with Lady Helena, who had sent several concerned notes of her own. But Catherine refused it all, terrified that any crack in her armor would lead to complete collapse, that she would find herself running back to Alexander and begging for whatever scraps of affection he might be willing to offer, dignity and self-preservation be damned. She knew herself well enough to understand that her resolve was finite, that given enough temptation she would abandon her principles and accept friendship when what she wanted was love, and so she avoided temptation entirely by avoiding everything and everyone connected to the brief, brilliant weeks when she had imagined a different future. As June progressed toward July, Catherine felt herself fading, becoming translucent like the ghosts she had once read about in novels, present but not quite real, going through the motions of existence without actually living. She ate because Mary insisted, slept fitfully because her body demanded it, performed the basic functions of survival without any real investment in continuing. It was a kind of death, she recognized, a choosing of safety over vitality, of numbness over pain, and there was a terrible comfort in it, in knowing that if she felt nothing, then nothing could hurt her. But even as she retreated further into her self-constructed tomb, even as she convinced herself that this isolation was necessary and right, Catherine could not quite extinguish the small flame of longing that persisted in her chest, the traitorous hope that whispered, perhaps, that suggested she might be wrong about Alexander's feelings, that reminded her of moments when his eyes had held something more than mere friendship. She crushed that hope ruthlessly each time it emerged, knowing that hope was the most dangerous thing of all, the emotion that could convince her to risk everything and lose it all. Better to be safe in her grief than destroyed by failed hope. Better to mourn what might have been than to discover with certainty that it could never be. And yet, in the darkest hours of the night, when sleep eluded her and honesty was unavoidable, Catherine acknowledged the terrible truth that Mary had tried to make her see. She was not protecting herself by withdrawing. She was simply exchanging one form of suffering for another, trading the risk of rejection for the certainty of loneliness. And while loneliness was familiar and therefore bearable, it was also soul-destroying in its slow, inexorable way. She was burying herself alive, just as Mary had accused, interring herself in black crape and false propriety while the world outside continued in all its messy, vibrant, complicated glory. But knowing the truth and having the courage to act on it were entirely different things, and as June faded into July, and Alexander's letters finally stopped coming, their absence somehow worse than their arrival, Catherine remained in her darkened sitting room, watching summer sunshine struggle through heavy curtains, mourning not Edmund, who had never deserved her tears, nor even Alexander, who she had lost by her own choice, but rather the woman she had briefly been during those weeks of friendship, the woman who had laughed freely and spoken boldly and allowed herself to hope for happiness, the woman who now seemed as lost and unreachable as any ghost, buried beneath layers of fear and self-protection that Catherine was no longer certain she had the strength to shed. The invitation to the Duchess of Pemberton's summer ball had arrived in mid-June, when Catherine was deep in her self-imposed isolation, and she had initially discarded it without a second thought, unable to imagine circumstances under which she would willingly enter a ballroom filled with the very society that had whispered about her friendship with Alexander. But Mary, with the persistence that had characterized all her attempts to draw Catherine out of her despair, had retrieved the invitation from the rubbish bin and placed it pointedly on Catherine's breakfast tray each morning for a week, until finally Catherine had acknowledged its existence with a weary sigh. "Your morning year is complete, Ma'am," Mary had said, her tone brooking no argument. "Lord Thomas himself said you should begin re-entering society. It would be improper to refuse the Duchess of Pemberton." And so Catherine had found herself, on a warm July evening when summer seemed determined to demonstrate London at its most oppressive, standing before her mirror as Mary fastened the buttons of a gown that represented yet another small rebellion against expectation. It was not the bright colours that would have been appropriate for a woman fully emerged from mourning, nor was it the unrelieved black she had worn for months. Instead, Catherine had chosen a gown of deep burgundy silk, the colour of wine or heart's blood, dark enough to suggest lingering grief, but rich enough to indicate she was no longer entirely lost in it. The bodice was cut in the current fashion, lower than anything she had worn during her marriage to Edmund, and the skirts fell in elegant folds that rustled with each movement. Mary had dressed her hair with care, pulling it back from her face in a style that was both sophisticated and severe. And around her neck, Catherine wore the only jewelry she possessed of any value, a simple strand of pearls that had been her mother's. Looking at herself in the mirror, Catherine barely recognized the woman staring back, someone who looked both wounded and defiant, vulnerable and determined, poised on the edge of something she could not quite name. "You look beautiful, Ma'am," Mary said softly, her eyes shining with emotion, like a woman ready to live again. Catherine was not certain she agreed with that assessment, but she was at least dressed, and the effort of preparation had carried her this far, so she might as well continue. The carriage ride to Pemberton House felt interminable, each turn of the wheels bringing her closer to a confrontation she both longed for and dreaded. She had not seen Alexander in nearly 6 weeks, had not responded to his letters or his messages, and the thought of encountering him in a crowded ballroom with hundreds of eyes watching their every interaction made her stomach twist with anxiety. Perhaps he would not be there, she told herself without much conviction. Perhaps he had already left London for his country estate, escaping the summer heat as most of society did. But even as she hoped for his absence, Catherine knew she would be devastated if he was not there, if her first re-entry into society did not include the chance to see his face, to gauge whether her withdrawal had damaged their connection beyond repair. Pemberton House blazed with light when Catherine's carriage pulled up to the entrance, hundreds of candles illuminating windows that stood open to catch any possible breeze, and the sounds of music and laughter spilled out into the street, creating an atmosphere of almost frantic gaiety. Catherine allowed a footman to hand her down from the carriage, then climbed the steps to the entrance, with her heart hammering so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. Inside, the ballroom was a crush of humanity. Ladies in gowns of every color imaginable, gentlemen in formal black and white, the air thick with the mingled scents of perfume and pomade and the flowers that festooned every available surface. Catherine paused at the entrance, momentarily overwhelmed by the assault on her senses after months of quiet isolation, and felt her resolve waver. She could still leave, could claim a headache or sudden illness, and retreat to the safety of her darkened sitting room. But even as the thought formed, she saw Mary's face in her mind, heard her maid's accusation that she was burying herself alive, and forced herself to step forward into the glittering crowd. The Duchess of Pemberton received her with cool courtesy, her eyes sharp as they assessed Catherine's burgundy gown and the bare ring finger where Edmund's wedding band had once sat. "You are looking well, Mrs. Ashworth," the Duchess said, her tone suggesting this was not entirely a compliment. "I am pleased to see you re-entering society. I trust your mourning period has brought you the peace you required." Catherine murmured some appropriate response and moved further into the ballroom, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing footman, more to have something to do with her hands than from any real desire to drink. She positioned herself near a bank of potted palms, where she might observe without being too obviously on display, and tried to calm her racing heart by cataloguing the familiar faces around her. There was Lady Pemberton holding court near the musicians, Lord Thomas Ashworth speaking with a group of gentlemen about what was no doubt some parliamentary matter, various acquaintances from her married life who nodded politely but did not approach, maintaining the careful distance society demanded from a woman whose reputation had been touched by scandal. And then she saw him, standing on the far side of the ballroom near the terrace doors, tall and severe in his formal black coat, and Catherine felt her breath catch in her throat, with an almost physical pain. Alexander looked thinner than she remembered, his face drawn as if he too had been sleeping poorly, and there were new lines around his eyes that spoke of strain. He was listening to something his sister Helena was saying, but his attention seemed elsewhere, his gaze scanning the crowd with an intensity that suggested he was searching for someone. Catherine's first instinct was to retreat, to hide behind the palms and avoid the confrontation she was not prepared to face. But even as she took a step backward, Alexander's eyes found hers across the crowded ballroom, and she saw shock register on his features, followed by something that looked almost like relief. He moved immediately in her direction, crossing the ballroom with long strides that suggested urgency, and Catherine felt panic rise in her chest. She was not ready for this, had no idea what to say to him after weeks of silence, no explanation for her withdrawal that would not reveal too much. But before Alexander could reach her, before Catherine could decide whether to flee or stand her ground, a voice cut through the ambient noise of the ballroom with the precision of a knife. "My dear," Lady Pemberton said loudly to the woman beside her, though her voice carried clearly to where Catherine stood. "Is it not fascinating how the Duke of Thornfield seems to prefer his women already deceased? First his perfect Margaret, now the half-dead widow Ashworth. Though I suppose there is a certain convenience to it, the departed require so much less effort than the living." The words landed like a slap, and Catherine felt the blood drain from her face as conversations around her stuttered to silence, dozens of eyes turning to assess her reaction. She stood frozen, humiliated beyond anything she had experienced even during Edmund's funeral, wanting desperately to disappear, but trapped by the weight of all those staring eyes. Lady Pemberton, a notorious gossip whose cruelty was legendary, but whose social position made her dangerous to cross, smiled with false sweetness, as if she had not just delivered a devastating insult to two people within easy earshot. Alexander had stopped mid-stride when Lady Pemberton spoke, and Catherine watched his expression transform from concern to fury so cold it seemed to lower the temperature of the entire ballroom. He turned slowly to face the woman who had spoken, and when he addressed her, his voice carried the kind of aristocratic contempt that could destroy a reputation with a single cutting phrase. "You dare speak of two women of incomparable worth," he said, each word falling like ice into the sudden silence, as if they were commodities for your amusement. "Mrs. Ashworth possesses more grace in her silence than you demonstrate in a lifetime of speech, and my late wife would have found your attempt to use her memory as a weapon against another woman utterly contemptible." Lady Pemberton's smile faltered, genuine shock registering on her face at being so publicly reprimanded by a duke. But Alexander was not finished. He crossed to where Catherine stood, still frozen in mortification, and took her cold hand in his, a gesture of support that was witnessed by everyone in the ballroom. "If you wish to discuss my preferences, madam," he continued, his eyes never leaving Catherine's face, "then let me be perfectly clear. I prefer women of intelligence and integrity, women who possess the courage to speak truth even when it is uncomfortable, women who value substance over spectacle. Mrs. Ashworth embodies all these qualities and more, and I count myself extraordinarily fortunate that she tolerates my company at all, much less honors me with her friendship." The ballroom remained silent, everyone absorbing this unexpected declaration, and Catherine felt tears prick her eyes at Alexander's fierce defense, even as her heart broke at his final word. Friendship. Even now, even in this moment of public revelation, that was all he could offer. She pulled her hand gently from his grasp, needing to escape before she completely fell apart in front of half of London society. "Please excuse me," she whispered, her voice barely audible, and turned toward the terrace doors, desperate for air and privacy and darkness to hide the tears that were already beginning to fall. She heard Alexander call her name, but did not stop. Pushing through the doors onto the terrace, where the night air hit her overheated skin like a blessing, she hurried down the steps into the garden beyond, following a gravel path that led away from the house, from the music and laughter and cruel whispers, needing distance from all of it. "Catherine!" The voice came from behind her, Alexander following at a distance that suggested he was trying not to overwhelm her, but was determined not to let her disappear. "Please, allow me to explain." Explain what? Catherine said without turning, her voice rough with unshed tears. That I am a pleasant distraction from your grief. That you feel obligated to defend me because I am pathetic and alone. That you value my friendship and wish to preserve it. She heard his sharp intake of breath, felt him come closer, though he still did not touch her. I have been a fool, he said quietly. Please, Catherine, look at me. She turned slowly, and in the moonlight filtering through the garden trees, she could see his face, see an expression she had never witnessed before, raw and vulnerable and utterly sincere. I thought I was being honorable, he said. I thought by maintaining the bounds of friendship I was protecting you, respecting the memory of both our spouses, preserving propriety. But in truth I was simply being a coward, afraid to acknowledge what I have felt since that first day in the park when you spoke to me with such honesty about grief. I won't be a poor substitute for, Catherine began, but Alexander interrupted her, his voice fierce with emotion. You are no substitute, he said, stepping close enough now that she could see the desperation in his eyes. That is what I have failed to understand, what I was too blind to recognize until I lost you. You are not Margaret, and I do not want you to be. Margaret was fire and passion, bold and brilliant and utterly fearless. She was perfect for who I was then, and I loved her with my whole heart. But you, Catherine, you are something entirely different and entirely yourself. You are quiet strength and resilient grace, intelligence tempered with compassion, courage that manifests not in loud declarations, but in small daily acts of bravery. Catherine felt her breath catch, afraid to believe what she was hearing, afraid to hope. You loved her, she whispered. You love her still. I will always love Margaret, Alexander agreed, his honesty painful but necessary. But love is not finite, Catherine. The heart does not have only one room for devotion to. I can love Margaret's memory and still have space for what I feel for you, which is different but no less profound. He reached out slowly, giving her time to retreat if she wished, and took both her hands in his thumbs tracing gentle circles on her palms. I have been walking through life as a memorial to my wife, he said, his voice breaking slightly. Performing grief, visiting that bench with roses, maintaining the shrine of our life together as if movement forward was betrayal. And then you appeared, and you understood the performance because you were doing the same thing. You saw through my careful facade to the loneliness beneath, and instead of being satisfied with surfaces, you demanded honesty. You made me laugh again, made me think about the future rather than simply existing in the past. You challenged my assumptions and refused to let me hide behind my title or my grief. And somewhere in all those conversations, in all those stolen afternoons, I fell in love with you. The words hung in the air between them, impossible and perfect, and Catherine felt something crack open in her chest, all the walls she had built to protect her heart crumbling at once. But you never said, she managed through tears that were now falling freely. You spoke only of friendship. Because I am an idiot, Alexander said with a self-deprecating smile. Because I convinced myself that what I felt was simply the comfort of companionship, that it would be disloyal to Margaret to love again so soon. It was only when you withdrew, when I lost the light of your company, that I understood the truth. I do not want your friendship, Catherine, though I treasure it beyond measure. I want your mornings and your evenings, your laughter and your tears, your brilliant mind and your generous heart. I want to wake beside you and fall asleep knowing you are near. I want to be the man who brings you joy rather than the duke who brings roses to a bench. I want, God help me, to love you for the rest of my life, if you will permit it. Catherine stared at him through her tears, seeing in his face the truth of every word, the vulnerability of a man who had finally allowed himself to feel again and was terrified of rejection. And she realized in that moment that she had a choice, could retreat back into safety and certainty, could protect her heart by refusing what was being offered, or she could be brave, could take the risk that loving required, could choose life over mere existence. And I thought I could never measure up to her, Catherine said, her voice shaking. I thought you would always compare me to your perfect wife and find me lacking. You are not lacking, Alexander said fiercely. You are different, and different is what I need. Margaret would have wanted me to live again, to find happiness rather than spending my life as a monument to the past. She would have liked you immensely, would have appreciated your intelligence and your courage. And more importantly, I like you, admire you, need you, love you, not because you remind me of her, but precisely because you do not. Catherine felt the last of her resistance crumble, and she stepped into his arms, feeling them close around her with a tenderness that made her weep harder. I love you, she whispered against his chest. I have loved you for so long, and I was so afraid. No more fear, Alexander said, his voice rough with emotion. No more hiding, no more performing grief we do not feel. Only honesty, only truth, only this. He tilted her face up to his grey eyes searching hers in the moonlight, and Catherine saw in them not the ghost of his dead wife, but rather her own reflection, valued and cherished and wholly seen. May I kiss you? He asked, the question formal, but his voice shaking with barely restrained emotion. Please, Catherine breathed, and then his lips were on hers, tender and passionate, and filled with all the longing of the weeks they had spent apart. And Catherine felt herself come alive in a way she never had before, not in the pallid kisses of her marriage, but in this meeting of equals, this joining of two people who had found each other through grief and chosen each other through love. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Alexander rested his forehead against hers and laughed shakily. We have just scandalized half of London, he said. Kissing in the garden at the Pemberton ball. The gossips will have material for months. Let them talk, Catherine said, surprised by her own boldness, and for the first time in her life meaning it. I am done living according to other people's expectations. Good, Alexander said, pressing a kiss to her forehead, her cheeks, the tip of her nose. Then marry me, Catherine Ashworth. Marry me, and we shall scandalize society together, two widowed souls who refused to let death be the end of their stories. Yes, Catherine said. The word simple but weighted with all the joy and hope and desperate love she had been holding back for so long. Yes, Alexander, yes. And as they stood together in the Pemberton garden, with music drifting from the ballroom and summer night wrapping around them like a blessing, Catherine understood that grief and love were not opposites, but rather different aspects of the same capacity for deep feeling, that honoring the past did not require sacrificing the future, and that sometimes, if one was very brave and very lucky, loss could be the doorway to finding something more precious than what had been left behind. The Pemberton garden stretched before them in silvered beauty, moonlight transforming the carefully manicured paths and flower beds into something almost otherworldly. And Catherine felt as though she had stepped outside of time itself, into a space where the rules and expectations that governed the ballroom behind them no longer applied. The night air was heavy with the scent of roses, their blooms pale and ghostly in the darkness, and somewhere nearby a nightingale sang its liquid song, oblivious to the human drama unfolding beneath the stars. Catherine and Alexander stood close enough to touch. his hand still holding hers, as if afraid she might disappear if he released her, and she could feel the tremor in his fingers that betrayed how deeply affected he was by what had just transpired between them. "I need you to understand," Alexander said, his voice low and urgent, searching her face in the moonlight as if trying to memorize every feature. "I need you to know that this is not some momentary impulse born of anger at Lady Pemberton's cruelty or a reaction to public humiliation. What I feel for you has been growing for months, but I was too blind, too caught in guilt and obligation to the past, to recognize it for what it was." Catherine felt fresh tears threaten, her emotions too close to the surface after weeks of suppression, and she gripped his hands tighter as if anchoring herself to this moment, to this reality that seemed too precious to be real. "Tell me," she whispered. "Please, Alexander, tell me everything. I need to hear it. Need to understand how this is possible." Alexander drew a shaky breath, and Catherine saw him gather his courage, saw the moment he chose vulnerability over self-protection, honesty over comfortable fiction. "When Margaret died," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "I thought my capacity for love had died with her. We had been married 8 years, and they were genuinely happy years. She was my partner in every sense, challenging me intellectually, supporting me emotionally, pushing me to be better than I would have been on my own. When the fever took her, it was sudden, brutal. One week she was vibrant and alive, planning a ball to raise funds for one of her causes, and the next she was gone, buried in the family vault while I stood in the rain and wondered how the world could continue when she was no longer in it." Catherine listened without interrupting, understanding that he needed to speak this truth, to acknowledge the depth of his loss before he could explain what had changed. In the ballroom behind them, music continued to play. A waltz drifting through the open terrace doors, but here in the garden there was only Alexander's voice and the night sounds and her own heartbeat loud in her ears. "For 2 years I existed rather than lived," Alexander continued. "I went through the motions of my responsibilities, managed my estates, attended Parliament, visited that bench in the park with roses because it made me feel close to her. But I was hollow inside, going through a performance of life while actually just waiting for it to end. My sister Helena was desperately worried, kept telling me I needed to move forward, but I could not see how. And then I met you." He paused, his grey eyes intense on her face, and Catherine felt her breath catch at the emotion she saw there, raw and unguarded. "I told myself our meetings were accidental at first," Alexander said. "That I was simply being kind to a woman who clearly understood grief. But even then, even in those first conversations, I felt something shift. You spoke to me without pretense, without the careful platitudes everyone else offered. You understood the performance of mourning because you were performing it yourself, and there was such relief in being able to speak honestly about the messiness of grief, the way it tangles with guilt and anger, and sometimes even relief." "Yes," Catherine breathed, recognizing everything he described, feeling the validation of her own complicated feelings about Edmund's death. As the weeks passed and our friendship deepened, Alexander continued. "I found myself looking forward to our afternoons together with an anticipation I had not felt in years. I would wake in the morning already planning what I might tell you, what book I might recommend, what topic we might debate. Helena noticed the change in me, told me I seemed lighter, more present, but I dismissed her observations. I convinced myself it was simply the comfort of good company, that friendship was all I felt or could feel." He released one of her hands to cup her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with such tenderness that Catherine felt tears spill over. "But I was lying to myself," he said. "Because what I felt when I was with you went far beyond simple friendship. I admired your intelligence, the way your mind worked through problems with careful logic. I appreciated your gentle humor, the way you could make me laugh without even trying. I valued your honesty, the courage it took for you to speak truth about a marriage that had brought you no joy. And I felt, God help me, protective and possessive in ways that had nothing to do with mere friendship. Then why? Catherine asked, her voice breaking. Why did you never say anything? Why did you let me believe I was simply a pleasant diversion, a way to pass time until you could return to mourning your perfect wife? Alexander's expression twisted with regret, and he closed his eyes briefly, as if the question pained him. Because I felt guilty, he said simply. I loved Margaret with my whole heart. When she died, I thought that heart died too. How could I move forward when she had been denied that chance? How could I find happiness when she was denied life? It felt like betrayal, like I was choosing to forget her by allowing myself to care for you. And beyond the guilt was fear, he continued, opening his eyes to meet hers with devastating honesty. Fear that what I felt for you was somehow diminished because it was different from what I felt for Margaret. She was fire, and I was drawn to her heat. You are quieter strength, and I feared that quiet meant less passionate, less real, less worthy of the name love. Catherine felt her heart twist at his words, understanding the doubt that had plagued him because it mirrored her own. And now, she asked quietly, what do you believe now? Alexander's hands trembled slightly as he cupped her face more fully, his forehead coming to rest against hers, their breath mingling in the small space between them. Now I understand what Helena tried to tell me months ago, he said, that the heart expands, it does not replace. I loved Margaret, and I will carry that love with me always, but it does not diminish what I feel for you. You are not second to anyone, Catherine. You are not a substitute or a replacement or a poor imitation of something I lost. You are entirely yourself, and it is you I love, you I want, you I need. How can you be certain? Catherine whispered, voicing the fear that had driven her retreat. I am not vivacious or beautiful or fearless like Margaret was. I am quiet and plain, and my greatest acts of courage are small, private things that no one notices. Alexander pulled back enough to look into her eyes, his expression fierce with an emotion that took her breath away. You are beautiful, he said emphatically. Your beauty is not loud or obvious, but it is no less real for its subtlety. And more than that, you are strong, Catherine. You endured 5 years of loveless marriage with grace and dignity. You discovered your husband's betrayal, and rather than becoming bitter, you used it as catalyst for growth. You questioned society's expectations and chose your own path even when it was frightening. You see me, truly see me, not the duke or the title or the wealth, but the man beneath all that. Do you understand how rare that is? How precious? Catherine felt something break open in her chest. All the years of believing herself inadequate, all the months of comparing herself to Margaret's perfection, all the fear that she could never be enough shattering under the weight of Alexander's words. She saw in his eyes that he meant every word, that he truly did see value in who she was, rather than measuring her against who she was not. I wore black for a man who never loved me, she said, her voice gaining strength even as tears continued to fall. I performed grief I did not feel because society demanded it. I retreated into isolation when I finally found joy because I was terrified of being hurt. I do not want to waste more of my life on fear, Alexander. I do not want to let cowardice steal what happiness might be possible. Then do not, Alexander said, his voice urgent and tender at once. Choose life, Catherine. Choose me. Let me spend the rest of my days proving you made the right choice. Let me show you what it means to be loved by someone who truly sees you and values who you are. Catherine felt the last of her resistance crumble. All the walls she had built to protect her wounded heart falling away to leave her utterly exposed and vulnerable and terrifyingly open. I choose you, she whispered. I choose this, whatever comes. I choose to be brave enough to love you, even though it terrifies me. Alexander's expression transformed, joy breaking across his features like sunrise, and he pulled her close with a sound that was half laugh and half sob. Thank you, he breathed against her hair. Thank you for trusting me with your heart. I swear to you, Catherine, I will treasure it as the precious gift it is. They stood holding each other in the moonlit garden, and Catherine felt peace settle over her for the first time in months, perhaps years. The nightingale continued its song, and the roses released their perfume into the night air. And somewhere in the ballroom, people were no doubt gossiping about the Duke and the widow who had disappeared together into the gardens. But none of it mattered, because she was here, in the arms of a man who loved her, truly loved her, not for her fortune or her compliance or her usefulness, but simply because she was herself. There is something I need to tell you, Alexander said after a moment, pulling back slightly to look at her face. Something I realized weeks ago but did not have the courage to acknowledge until tonight. Catherine waited, her heart still racing but no longer with fear, and Alexander smiled, an expression of such tenderness that it made her breath catch. Do you remember that first day in the park, he asked, when I told you I brought roses to Margaret's bench? Catherine nodded, and Alexander continued, his voice soft with wonder. I have not been back to that bench in 6 weeks, not once since you withdrew from my life. Catherine's eyes widened in surprise, and Alexander nodded at her unspoken question. I could not bear to go there, he explained, because every time I thought about those memorial roses, I realized that for months I had been bringing roses to you in my heart instead. Every beautiful thing I encountered, I wanted to share with you. Every interesting thought, I wanted to discuss with you. Every morning I woke thinking of you, and every night I fell asleep remembering our conversations. You became my living memorial, Catherine, the person I honored not with cut flowers that would fade, but with the gift of my genuine presence and engagement. Tears were flowing freely down Catherine's face now, and she made no attempt to stop them, overwhelmed by the beauty of what he was describing. I did not know, she whispered. I thought I was simply convenient company while you truly mourned. Never simply anything, Alexander said fiercely. You were never convenient or simple or merely anything. You were the woman who brought me back to life without even trying, who made me remember what it felt like to anticipate tomorrow rather than merely endure it. And I have been a complete fool for not telling you sooner, for letting you doubt your value for even a moment. He kissed her then, and this kiss was different from the first, less desperate and more reverent, a seal on promises spoken, and a beginning of promises yet to be made. Catherine felt herself melt into his embrace, her hands coming up to tangle in his hair, and she kissed him back with all the passion she had been suppressing for months, all the love she had been afraid to acknowledge, all the hope she had tried to crush before it could destroy her. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Alexander rested his forehead against hers and laughed shakily. We are creating quite the scandal, he said. The gossips will be merciless. Let them talk, Catherine said, echoing her earlier boldness and meaning it even more now. I have spent my entire life trying to meet other people's expectations, trying to be what I thought I should be rather than who I am. I am done with that, Alexander. If society wishes to condemn us for finding happiness after loss, then society can be damned. Alexander's eyes widened slightly at her vehemence, and then he threw back his head and laughed, a sound of pure joy that Catherine had never heard from him before. God, I love you, he said when he could speak again. Your quiet courage is going to remake me entirely, Catherine Ashworth. I can feel it already. Good, Catherine said, surprised by her own daring, and Alexander laughed again before pulling her close and simply holding her, both of them swaying slightly to the distant music from the ballroom. Marry me, he said after a moment, the words soft against her hair. I know I asked before, but I want to ask properly, without the heat of the moment clouding it. Marry me, Catherine. Be my wife, my partner, my love. Let us build a life together that honors our pasts without being imprisoned by them. Let us scandalize society and please ourselves and create something entirely new. Yes, Catherine said without hesitation, pulling back to look into his eyes so he could see the certainty in hers. Yes, Alexander, 1,000 times yes. They sealed the promise with another kiss, and then another, until finally Alexander groaned and stepped back, his breathing ragged, and his eyes dark with desire that made Catherine's pulse race. We should return to the ballroom, he said, though his tone suggested this was the last thing he wanted to do. Or I am going to thoroughly compromise you in the Pemberton garden, and while I care nothing for society's opinion, I would prefer not to force you into marriage through scandal. I am already thoroughly compromised, Catherine pointed out, and was delighted when Alexander's eyes flared with heat. But you are right. We should return. Though I confess I have no idea what to say to people. The truth, Alexander said simply, taking her hand and tucking it into the crook of his arm. We will tell them the truth, that the Duke of Thornfield has been fortunate enough to win the affection of Mrs. Catherine Ashworth, that we are engaged to be married, and that anyone who has a problem with it can direct their concerns to me personally. Catherine laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years, perhaps ever, and allowed Alexander to lead her back along the moonlit path toward the ballroom. As they emerged from the garden onto the terrace, Catherine saw several faces turn in their direction, saw Lady Pemberton's expression of shock quickly masked by false congratulation, saw Helena Pritchard's face light up with genuine joy. The music had stopped, and conversations stuttered to silence as people registered their joined hands and the obvious intimacy between them. Alexander led Catherine to the center of the ballroom, and in a voice that carried to every corner of the room, announced simply, Mrs. Ashworth has done me the extraordinary honor of agreeing to become my wife. I trust you will all join me in celebrating this happy news. There was a moment of shocked silence, and then Helena rushed forward with a cry of delight, embracing Catherine despite all rules of propriety. I am so happy for you both, she said, tears in her eyes. So very happy. Margaret would have approved wholeheartedly. Catherine felt her own tears threaten again at the generous blessing, and she returned Helena's embrace with feeling. Thank you, she whispered. That means more than you know. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of congratulations, genuine and otherwise, and through it all, Alexander remained at Catherine's side, his hand at the small of her back or holding hers, a constant presence that announced to everyone that she was valued, protected, cherished. When they finally departed near midnight, Catherine felt exhausted but exhilarated, as if she had run a great distance and arrived somewhere wonderful. As Alexander handed her into her carriage, he held her hand a moment longer than necessary. Tomorrow, he said. May I call on you tomorrow? We have plans to make. Tomorrow, Catherine agreed, and then on impulse leaned forward to kiss him once more, brief but sweet. And the next day, and the day after that, and all the days after. All the days, Alexander agreed, his eyes holding hers with a promise that made her heart race. All of them, my love, for the rest of our lives. And as the carriage pulled away, Catherine looked back to see Alexander standing in the light, spilling from Pemberton House, watching her departure with an expression of such love that it stole her breath, and she knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right choice, that grief and fear had been vanquished by the courage to choose life, to choose love, to choose the uncertain but beautiful future that awaited her in the arms of a man who saw her truly and loved her completely, not despite who she was, but because of it, and that was worth any scandal, any whisper, any judgment society might offer.